Hi, and welcome to Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Today I'm going to read to you from Flowers of Evil by N.L. Holmes. Chapter 1. After one last look up and down the street, Neferet finally pulled the gate shut and slid the heavy bolt. She heaved a dispirited sigh. To the woman of her heart and fellow Sunnet, Bener-ib, who stood in the doorway of the little dispensary, she said, "Either this is the healthiest neighborhood in the two lands, or people just aren't coming to us when they need a doctor. Where are all the patients who used to go to that Kuit for healing? She was mostly just a witch, but look at all the people who turned to her for help," said Bener-ib disconsolately. "It's because we're women," Neferet said, leaning against the gate. "Kuit was a woman." "It's because we're young women. Nobody can believe a couple of girls have any wisdom." Neferet clenched her teeth and thrust out her lip, an all too familiar anger rising in her. "People don't seem to care that we were royal physicians for Akat Keprura. We're literate. We may be young, but we know all that anybody has ever learned about medicine because we can read." Bener-ib nodded, but she was already convinced. Making other people realize that was the hard part. "Should we give up and go back to helping Lady Jefat-nepti?" she asked in a small voice. Neferet wasn't so quick to accept defeat. "Never. We can make Lord Tamez's servants come to us, and Papa's too, and Uncle Pipis and Ahaz and Pakikis and Sati and Maya's and—" "They already do. They're just not sick very often." Bener-ib, a tiny bird-boned person with a big head of slender braids, seemed to wilt visibly with discouragement. Here was their insurmountable problem. Two young women from good families who had studied medicine since their earliest adolescence under the greatest woman doctor alive, the physician of the royal ornaments, had given up a lucrative and prestigious post at the palace to serve the residents of this modest working-class neighborhood of Wasset. But why? People were already asking suspiciously, as if they thought it betrayed some dishonesty on the part of the two well-meaning young women. Neferet had always had the unconventional notion that even the poorest workmen should be well cared for, as their own family servants were. It embarrassed her, pained her, to see ordinary people dragging through life with unset fractures and fly-blown eyelids. Their lives were hard enough without all that. Besides, her honest, straightforward nature had been painfully constrained in the stifling atmosphere of court etiquette. So here they finally were, full of idealism and the desire to do good, and nobody came to them, not even the clients of the ancient healer who had inhabited their little dispensary before them. It made Neferet angry just to think of it. She let out a breath through her nose like a blast of steam. "We're not babies. We're 24 years old. We've been studying for half our lives. There's no reason for this." "It was nice of Lord Tamez to make that tax collector of his come when he had a boil on his neck," said Bener-ib optimistically. Tamez was Neferet's husband, in name at least. Despite the fact that she was younger than most of his children, the two had agreed to a union that served their mutual convenience. Tamez, a friend of Neferet's father, was a grieving widower who wanted no more of women. The pro forma marriage kept away his avid suitors, and Neferet just needed an appearance of respectable matronhood to cloak her relationship with Bener-ib. Lord Tamez, who since his first wife's death went by his childhood nickname Maya, was also one of the richest and most blue-blooded personages in the city of the scepter, and the master of the double house of silver and gold. He could certainly use his influence to steer patients to them, but those were people who could afford a good doctor anyway. Neferet scrunched down her brow in an effort at hard thought. She cast her eyes around the courtyard of the little house, all neatly swept with medicinal herbs, planted in beds outlined by whitewashed rocks. 3 dogs lay sprawled here and there in the shade of the wall, panting, following her with their eyes, as if it would help if they could. A one-eyed cat stretched his leg overhead and licked in improbable places. "We'd better be going," said Bener-ib after a moment. The children and their nursemaid will be home by now and wonder where we are. I guess you're right. It just makes me mad is all. Neferet checked the animal's water bowl and squatted to pet the largest dog, who grinned up at her. You boys guard the house well. All right, Mangler? Cheetah, don't let any rats get our goose fat. The shadows of a long summer evening stretched from house to house as they emerged into the street. Some of the neighbours were sitting on their doorsteps or leaning over the parapet of their roof terrace, enjoying a breath of cooler air, while their children, liberated at last from a day of work, ran around and played. They nodded respectfully as the two young doctors passed. Evening, Hotep. Evening, Sit Amen, Neferet called cheerfully. She knew them all and would have sworn they all liked her. Sit Amen, the dyer's wife, brought them fried bread treats and honey when she made them for her family. But nobody came for healing. Neferet saw one of the children had a sty on his eyelid. You need to put something on that eye, little man. Tell your mamma to bring you to our dispensary and we'll get you all fixed up. Yes, Lady Neferet, said the mother from the doorway. Neferet knew she wouldn't come. The packed earth streets of the southern capital, with its crowd of walled houses and yards, held in the early summer afternoon's heat and radiated it back like an oven at the end of the day. It was a relief to enter the lofty red-painted gate of Lord Tames's villa and find themselves in the cool and beauty of a garden full of colour, fresh pools, and soul-tickling scents. Neferet heard men's voices in the garden and cried in delight, It's Papa! She grabbed Bener-ib's hand and drew the smaller woman after her at a run towards the pavilion sheltered by vines, where her husband received guests in the evening. Ducks scattered before them, squawking indignantly as the two pelted up the gravel walk towards the small stone building with its broad porch and delicate painted columns. Two men sat in comfortable low-backed chairs under its shelter, beer pots and straws before them on a pair of graceful stands. Everything in Tames's house was beautiful. At first Neferet had felt a bit intimidated by the perfection everywhere, but she wasn't the sort to stay intimidated long. Lord Tames, as usual, was dressed to the same perfection, even in the relaxed privacy of his own home. In his late 50s, he was tall and slim and still strikingly handsome, with chiselled features and heavy-lidded black eyes. But more important, under his rather frosty exterior, he was a good man. He generously permitted Neferet to spend his gold however she liked, and had welcomed the army of cast-off or disabled animals she had collected. And he had opened his home to the 6 fatherless children she and Bener-ib had taken in after their mother abandoned them. Not just everybody would have done that, the young woman told herself gratefully, because, on top of everything, they were especially rowdy children. Beside him sat Hani, son of Merida, Neferet's beloved father. She observed with affection that he was the exact opposite of his friend in appearance, a broad, squat, heavy-set man with a square jaw, laughter-crinkled little eyes, and a wide grin that bared the space between his front teeth. Everybody said she was a younger female version of her papa, which suited her fine, even if, in spite of her name, she wasn't as beautiful as Mama and her sisters. She was smart like Papa, too, who could speak many languages. He was a High Commissioner of Foreign Affairs in the north, right below the Vizier of the Upper Kingdom, and she loved him more than anything, except Bener-ib. But then she had known Papa all her life. She was his little duckling. The two men looked up as the woman skidded to a halt in the gravel. "Papa, you're here." "In the flesh, and plenty of it, as grandfather would say," Hani said with a laugh, extending his arms. Neferet threw herself on him with such exuberance that a less solid man would have tottered. "Hello, Lord Tames. Are you eating here tonight, Papa?" She took her seat on her father's lap. "No, my duckling. I just dropped in to ask your husband's opinion on something, and he was kind enough to offer me some of his delicious herbed beer before I left." Tames gave his cool, enigmatic smile. "Ibet and I have been discussing how to get word of our practice out. Nobody's coming. and I just can't believe there aren't any accidents or diseases in the whole neighbourhood." "Surely your sister brings her children," Hani said. Sathut Haru and her husband Maya lived in Maya's old family home, a former goldsmith's workshop, just around the corner from the dispensary. "Unfortunately, they're healthy. I mean fortunately." Bener-ib grew scarlet with embarrassment. She probably wouldn't say anything else for the rest of the evening, fearing she had disgraced herself. "Our families and friends all together won't keep us very busy. It's just rotten the way people won't give us a chance. They don't know what they're missing." Papa gave her a squeeze and said, "Maybe it will just take time." "Is there another practitioner in the area?" Lord Thomas asked. "Someone who may be draining off your potential patients?" "I don't know." Neferet shot Bener-ib a curious glance. "Have you heard anything, Ibet?" The girl shook her head, but then her face lit up. "Oh, I think there is. I heard mention of somebody called Jedhar. I don't think he's a real Sunu, though." "Well, there you go, my duckling. Either work out some division of labour with this Jedhar, as Kuit must have done, or see if you can't win some of his patients over. Maybe you take the women, he takes the men." At last, some progress. Neferet was ready to charge out and beard this fellow, but of course it was too late in the day. Perhaps they could even negotiate some form of partnership. The possibilities were a delightful challenge to her ingenuity. The two young women bade Papa and Thomas good evening and headed off to the nursery to have dinner with the children. "Let's go see this Jedhar tomorrow," Neferet said as they walked. "Maybe he'll be reasonable." Bener-ib looked dubious. Men aren't always reasonable. "If we can't charm him, we'll fight. We'll win." Permission to take over the rear area of Lord Thomas's garden, behind the wall that separated the fancy part from the practical part. Under the shade of the huge sycamore figs planted by his ancestors, the younger ones were playing a noisy tug-of-war, while the nursemaid looked on in boredom, fanning herself with a trimmed palm frond. Hume, the oldest boy, who was about 12, and his 13-year-old sister Muttoy were hunched over a game of hounds and jackals. All at once the girl gave a howl of frustration and surged to her feet, her face crimson and scowling. Hume shrank back and murmured something apologetic, but Muttoy stalked away. Suddenly she seemed to become aware of the two young women and froze. "Hello, Muttoy," said Neferet pleasantly. "Have you people eaten yet?" The girl appeared to be disarmed by the absence of reprimand. Her scowl went blank with confusion. She was getting to be tall and gangling, like her mother, with a thin, pretty face, usually by a glower. No," she said, almost civil in spite of herself. Hume said meekly, "Nurse said we'd wait for you and Lady Bener-ib." The nurse came hurrying up. "I hope that's all right, Lady Neferet. Quen and Shuroy were fighting again on the way home. They ought to go without." "Of course, we'll eat together. Quen and Shuroy too. We're a family now." Certainly Neferet, for all her occasionally naughty childhood, had never been deprived of dinner. It seemed barbaric to her, given how convivial family dinners had always been at home. "You can tell cook we'll eat out here." "We're not a family," growled Muttoy. "You're not our mother, neither one of you." Neferet and Bener-ib exchanged weary glances. Even after months of effort, the girl wasn't ready to unbend. The other children had come around to a large extent. Hume, like the little grown-up he was, already apprenticed to Maya's mother as a goldsmith. Muttoy was hard as the kernel of a Persea fruit, always bristling with resentment at the double tragedy that had struck her real family. And then, only a few months ago, her old grandfather had gone to join his ancestors. She had to feel thoroughly abandoned. The servants emerged with tables and stools, and everybody took a seat, with much struggling over who got to sit where. "Count off now," Neferet said loudly. "We don't play favourites." Still giggling, the children began to count off, but 3-year-old Tiri only knew one number. "Hamtao, 3." so another struggle erupted over who got to be third. The little girl seemed to find the chaos she had sown hilarious. At last the children sat 2 by 2 at the small folding tables, and the ordeal of passing out food began. Neferet didn't know what the family had been given to eat, because they didn't seem to like anything that came their way, except the roast duck stuffed with cracked wheat, which they gobbled down like starving animals. Only the baby, placidly seated in the nurse's lap, sucking his grubby thumb, had no comment.